We take these public lands for granted, these forests that are owned by all of us, but it was almost 100 years ago that these public forests, that the stake of these public forests was in peril. The fact that we own them, the fact that we have a National Forest Service, we owe in part to this one fire, the Big Burn of 1910, the biggest wildfire in American history. 3 million acres destroyed in less than a weekend, 5 towns burned to the ground, 100 men dying. And growing up in the Northwest, I'm a third-generation Northwesterner, I'd always heard about this mythic fire, this big burn that people spoke of almost in legendary and hushed tones. But the more I got into the story, the more I realized there's a fantastic backstory here. Let's start with Teddy Roosevelt. We all think we know something about TR. He was on Mount Rushmore. He was the youngest president, of course. He was the most prolific. He used to consume 2,000 calories before lunch. He essentially gave us these public lands. We owe these wonderful forests that all of us own, the American birthright, because of Roosevelt. You can't understand this fire without understanding Teddy Roosevelt, a man driven by singular passion for the outdoors, and that democracy, American democracy, could only be fulfilled if all of us had a stake in this public land. And history really did turn because of Roosevelt and the people who were with him. They essentially invented the term conservation. It was an unknown thought. It was a radical idea. We had nothing like this in our lexicon until Teddy Roosevelt came along. Now, his closest aide was Gifford Pinchot. In fact, Pinchot said he invented the term conservation. We have a Gifford Pinchot National Forest, but nobody knows who he is. He was the founder of the United States Forest Service. When this fire happened, the Forest Service was only 5 years old. That was Pinchot's baby. That was his life passion, was the Forest Service. And this baby was nearly stillborn. Pinchot was, like Roosevelt, a very wealthy man. In fact, his grandfather did a clear cutter. But he came to his love of the outdoors young, just as Roosevelt did. And Roosevelt later said of Pinchot that Pinchot was the conscience of my administration. Now, he was a really quirky guy. He was married for 20 years to his dead lover, a ghost, this spirit, if you will, who stayed with him for 20 years. Gangly, big, tall guy. He was 6 inches taller than Roosevelt. He used to stoop over him. In fact, they sort of bonded initially over wrestling together in their underpants and boxing. They did these manly things together. 2 sons of wealth who became proponents of this populist idea that all Americans owned all this land. They always talked about this being land for the little guy, not the rich guy. The fact that we have an area nearly the size of France that all Americans own, we owe largely to Roosevelt and Pinchot. The third character in this historic drama is John Muir. Everybody thinks they also know a little bit about John Muir. He's from Scotland, had that long beard, made him look like a Santa Claus type, was also a quirky original character. He used to lash himself to trees when windstorms would come along because he wanted to feel the wind. He was the real radical, if you want to say conservation was radical. He was the outside voice. Pinchot and Roosevelt had to deal with the governing. Muir was the soul. Muir was the person who urged, go for the most expansive. So this is the founding trio, basically, of American conservation. And this is what they were up against. An American public that didn't really know what this idea of conservation was, that was used to taking things for free. Also, this wealthy elite, the Rockefellers, the Guggenheims, the Morgans who owned the railroads, the banks, the mines, the timber companies. And so the stage was set. The Gilded Age powers didn't want to release their grip on land and resources they'd always had. The idea of conservation brought by Roosevelt and Pinchot, that this land was owned by all Americans. And then came the Big Burn, the fire of 1910. The public hears about these brave men fighting huge walls of flame. They're heroes. These people who were cast about to the West, who were considered sissies in Roosevelt's Green Rangers, suddenly they're heroic. They're like soldiers in a battle. So it changes public opinion for conservation. Roosevelt's great experiment, this great crusade as they called it, the battle is essentially won because of the fire. So what's fascinating to me is that what came from this most catastrophic of wildfires was the protection for these public lands that we all enjoy, that our children enjoy, that our grandkids can enjoy. We have this land forever in part because of that awful fire.